I haven't wanted to delve into these topics in quite a while because of the fact that most of the core demographics on here end up being men, but I do see that there are at least some guys that are willing to actually, you know, be educated about women's issues and everything. And, I can't sit here and come up on my platform and pretend that I'm uneducated as at all about the shit affecting women. I'm just like the bad mood bear, about dealing with men who don't, you know, who deflect and they don't want to have a discussion about it. They want to avoid it, and they will do everything in their power to shut it down, as far as discussions about women's issues, and those tapes really annoy me. Like, they make me want to put a fucking tire iron through their fucking heads so that once the skull is gone, maybe our logic will actually finally penetrate. I'm being a little bit rhetorically extreme here. I realize I don't really want to engage in violence. Violence is bad. Okay, I just thought my way of saying it is a bit colorful. I don't really want to engage in violence. It's just, these people are extraordinarily frustrating, and it's like you're up and trying to debate somebody that's behaving in an incredibly blockheaded fashion. Now, I individually, I do agree with those of you who say, quote, "Women have never had it so good." I'm not disputing that fact. I do believe it's pretty much established, but that fact doesn't take us to where a lot of people here on YouTube would love it to take us, to where, it seems that what they want to go from is to extrapolate from there to feminism is no longer needed, the work of feminism is no longer required. And it just, see, that's another, that argument is what you call a non sequitur. It's where the conclusion doesn't follow the premise, you know? Like, the conclusion doesn't ultimately follow from the premise there. It's like, it just ends up being all messed up. And, you know, Roe versus Wade just got overturned by our Supreme Court. There was a 40-year long project to actually do it, to take away, women's rights to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Now, I individually, I'm a bit too educated into matters, about all this to sit here and pretend that I don't understand. Like, I have put myself and rendered myself in that boat because for me, I went and asked questions. I've always been the type to question everything. And so, I went out and I, decided to ponder ultimately about why, there were doctors that were initially opposed to Roe versus Wade and what made them change their minds on the issue and basically support a women's right to terminate. And we ended up finding out that they were the ones that had to deal with women that, put the coat hanger in their, you know what, down there and poked at it and went to back alley abortionists and, the people that didn't really know what they were doing, and then, ended up in the doctor's offices for internal bleeding related complications from, terminating successfully, but not doing it in a very sterile fashion, to say the least, about and then ending up with complications later after the fact because of the fact that they didn't use sterile equipment to to do this, and they didn't properly stitch them up afterwards. So, there were problems with all that, and these women ended up having major complications as a result. And you, as a doctor, you go through that a few dozen times, and pretty soon you start to realize that it doesn't matter if it's illegal or not, that a lot of women are going to take this into their own hands ultimately, and that women will not. When you deny women choice, as you should be expect, they will take desperate actions, in order to do what they want to do. And we have this way of thinking, I think, in 2022 where it's like, oh, women won't act like they did back then. Like they've been fundamentally pacified as a group of people, but it's like you'd be surprised at, how quickly all of that, all that has changed about the way that women act can completely reverse to the way that it was before. you know, like it will happen. Just fuck around and find out about this. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court decided that they were going to fuck around, and now America's about to find out. And it's not pretty, to say the least. I, for myself, for the record, did my bit in advocacy. I said my piece about it, which was that abortion is healthcare, and the reason why it's healthcare is because some pregnancies are life threatening, and there's ectopic pregnancies. Like I, unfortunately, to my great despair, you know, I find myself saying things these days like learning how to read was the greatest mistake of my life. As far as these tag groups on Facebook, because in a lot of respects, unfortunately, having gained knowledge has really opened the doorways to a lot of empathetic distress and depression, to say the least. I've taken a body blow to myself by, educating myself into women's choice, into the women's movements and the issues that were affecting women. I did it, you know, by choice and deliberately, knowing full well that it could potentially hurt like a ton of bricks. I mean, I invited it in knowing full well that I was going to suffer consequences for it, and I have, like this has not been a consequence-free experience for me. Among other things, there are men that I will never be able to be friends with because of the fact that I am on the side of the debate that I'm on, that will just outright boycott me and any association with me because of the fact that, I'm with the quote unquote baby killers side of the debate. I, you know, I don't I don't think of it as murder, but they do. I mean, I guess it's complicated for me because even the fetal heartbeat bill just it's a little bit like frogs have heartbeats, dude. Like I think that, there are pretty deep questions about how far along in a pregnancy that, a person has to go before the actual, thing that's in development is as human like as possible. And that's a question that it hasn't really ultimately settled for me, but I don't think it begins at conception, to say the least. I just don't share that perspective, very early on, especially it's just a clump of cells. And, from aside from all of that, I mean, it's like what business is it of mine anyways? It's not my body. You know what I mean? I don't understand in this nation, the way that things are because so many of us in so many other contexts will basically say mind your own business, but in this one it wants big daddy government, seven kinds of up in a woman's uterus, and it's just not cool at all, to say the least. It's kind of unhip, and not kind of, it very much is unhip. The thing that really bugs me is just, like I said, though, my formal education, or not informal, really rather informal education into women's matters, as informal as it happened to be, you know, it unfortunately left me in this state of realizing that, Roe versus Wade didn't create abortion; it just made it more safe. That the post Roe America will just be an America of the same abortions, just less safe than they were before this whole fiasco. And if that, and will only push women back into the arms of back alley abortionists, and out of the hands of doctors all over again. And it's like, the fact that women have to go through this whole fucking process of winning back the rights that their grandmothers fought for them in the first place and their mothers fought to won for them, it's all fucking ridiculous. And unfortunately, this is the one issue. I get accused of white knightery, but the thing is that for me, at the end of the day, feminists can say, well, it's sexist to say that women need men, but I would now this gets complicated. It creates a crux of complication because the basic question fundamentally, I think myself, comes down to should women need men? And for me, the answer is fuck no. You shouldn't. It's wild and radically inappropriate that, you know, that be the case. And it's completely antithetical to what feminism is about for women to be in a state of dependency on us, you know? But, this comes down to the difference between, should versus what actually is. And it comes down to this need to live in the real world and contend with reality on the terms of reality because people do not ultimately live their lives according to the edicts of ideology, fortunately and unfortunately in a lot of ways. And I wouldn't say that it was clear cut unfortunate, but it does create a lot of issues, in this whole space. And it creates this internal schism in my own head because for me it's like, yes, it's completely antithetical to the feminist cause for women to need men, but unfortunately we live in a world in which your my protection is unfortunately needed. And the reason why I'm necessary is complicated, but it boils down to this. Basically, women, as it stands, they have over half the population right now in the United States. All things considered, if they were able to put their petty squabbles with each other aside and start working together, I wouldn't be necessary. You know, there's no need for me to really be needed by them. You know, but we find ourselves in a world in which women are also beset by issues of internalized misogyny, where there are literally women who are misogynistic themselves. I mean, Exhibit A would be Laurie Alexander, the transformed wife. She's not alone though in that sort of woman on woman antagonism. It's not like Laurie Alexander is just one place in one direction you can look in for an example of that sort of internalized misogyny as an issue where they're fighting each other. But my primary point is that when it comes to politics and when it comes to matters of power, women do need men for the sole reason ultimately that the way and the manner in which we actually cast our ballots can be pretty essential and devastatingly impactful to what their rights ultimately are. And that while it leaves me as a feminist activist in a state of complete discomfort and like this is radically inappropriate that things be this way, and that I have this much power over how your lives are ultimately impacted, like that puts me in a position of being a patriarch that actually has to try to behave in a benevolent fashion in looking after you. And I don't think it's appropriate that I have that kind of power. Like all of this, has slammed against me in a way in which I feel every bit of it is incredibly inappropriate. But that is the world that I live in. Welcome to fucking Gilead. You know, I mean, I hate it. I didn't vote for this. I didn't fight for this. This is not the world that I believe in. We're not in that world. In the world that I want to live in, like as much as I've been an advocate for greater democracy on this one cause, really, I just think that it shouldn't be up to the voters what, women's rights ultimately are. I really do. I think that democracy should butt the fuck out on this one and that we have no business voting. put as voters putting ourselves between a woman and her doctor. I just don't. Like every part of this is a sour fucking deal for me. And while at the and the more depressing aspect of it is that I'm not the real victim of any of it. Women are going to be impacted worse than this, but that is what you would call a cold comfort. You know, I have empathy for the plight of the opposite sex, and it hurts. You know, I realize that in my empathy, I am still not going to be hurt as and suffer the same degree of emotional anguish that they are going to suffer, but that does not mean that this issue, when it comes to Roe versus Wade, has not had a very powerful, you know, and hurtful effect on me emotionally. I weep, for the women that are going to be negatively impacted by this. Maybe I don't want you to see it on fucking camera, me falling apart in that kind of way, but it has not been easy. It was a body blow to me as well, you know, hearing, stories about what was taking place in Planned Parenthood on the night that it happened, women talking about how they were going to take matters into their own hands. I mean, this has been a nightmare that has been kicking around in my head for a long time, and to see it become a reality has been hurtful, profoundly, you know? And I think that one of the more hurtful aspects of it is that, when I'm open about this, sometimes I get women that are, engaged in sarcastic mocking, like, you're a man. I mean, you're not the real victim of any of it. And it's like, I'm not trying to appropriate, I just, I think that this oppression Olympics crap is a pretty sour deal for everybody, not just me, you as well. And if I play the oppression card at all, it's mostly on the basis of autism because white men are not oppressed and are not an oppressed class of people, much as they would love to be. In a lot of ways, for the benefits that seems to bestow on certain groups of people, and you see a lot of these guys acting this way, and they've got this martyrdom complex where like they want to be the real victims so desperately, and it's really rather pathetic. But this one was not one of the as much as it probably devastated women a lot worse than it did me, it was not without emotional scarring for me. And while those are invisible wounds that you can't see outwardly, I just want it to be registered for the record that this was painful. It was a shock and it hurt. I think that we all kind of knew it was coming after the Supreme Court, draft leak and everything, but bracing for impact and everything just didn't make anything any better here. It just didn't. There was no there was no mitigating, the way that this was going to hurt. And I coming out on the other side of all of it, the implications and all things considered, it's like, yeah, it's inappropriate, it's antithetical to feminism, things shouldn't be this way, but tough shit, that's the way that they are, you know, sort of, and it's such a shame that that's the way that they are. I don't mean to be completely unsympathetic to that because, it isn't a tough shit sort of thing. It's just this is the world that we live in, and it's not quite up to snuff, to say the least. And it's just like women may have been taking over most of the positions of power. Far more of them are successful than we as men are today. All of that is true, but you know, nevertheless, these guys like myself who are nowhere near as successful as the female doctors and what if today have been put in a position where we have just as much power and influence at the ballot box as a doctor that's far better educated than we are has. And that in of itself is rather problematic, but it's nevertheless the dystopian world that we live in. Democracy has often been founded on the notion that some Kansas inbred gets the same vote as somebody that literally goes to college and has all of that, knowledge and power under its belt. And, I do kind of stand with the Asimovs of the world and quotes on that, that's not, it's the dystopian aspect of democracy. And as much as I just, I have a lot of, internal conflicts because of all of this that have been had a light shined on them in an extreme way for me, and that, I believe in democracy. I'm a big believer in small d democracy, but I now have to contend with the reality that there are so many things that I believe shouldn't be up to the voters, for better or worse on this. My transformation into a more and more, awake person when it came to women's issues has, as a journey in a lot of ways, been, agonizingly painful. But I felt that the one thing that it did was bring me closer to the opposite sex. And so it was like, I realize that I'm hurting myself, but I will keep doing it because of the fact that it helps, close gaps that exist between me and you as women. I feel that the pain and the frustration and all the hurt and all of the empathy and all of the heartbreak, every bit of it was a price that I was willing to pay to feel connected and closer to you as women if you are watching this. So I threw myself at education into these matters and to women's studies with some passionate force, despite the fact that I now must acknowledge that the more I know, the more it will hurt. So in all of this, I'm trying to gently lead you to a conclusion. You know, the truth of the matter is that women have it better today than their grandmothers did and their mothers did. But there is still so much more work that needs to be done. So much more. And the conclusion that women have it better now than they ever have does not mean that the work of feminism has been finished. I I hope this has been enlightening for you, and I, just wanted to say from me to you, have a nice rest. Oyasumi Nasai, good night to you. I may not be going to sleep immediately, but you probably are. If you've given me the 20 minutes of your time that this took, thank you, for your time, and good night.